Out of consideration for our speaker and the meeting, there is no talking while they are at the podium. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, John Jay.
My name is John, and I'm an alcoholic. And I am sober today by the grace of God and by the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I haven't been to this meeting in maybe 25 years. It used to be the kind of Sunday go-to-church meeting. And then about, I guess it was 10 or 12 years ago, my wife and family, we moved over to the Valley. And that was right during the period of time where we had the great expanse of AA. And so, with only a tiny exaggeration, I can hit a golf ball from my house to 40 meetings a week, okay? And so I kind of stay close. I love this meeting because now what I do is I search out meetings where I'm not even close to being the longest sober person in the building. And I'm sober 37 years, so it gets to be a chore. But over in Burbank, they have this great meeting on Tuesday nights called the 30-30 meeting. And it's a 1-hour, 2-speaker meeting, and you got to have 30 years to speak. Radford Hall has a Wednesday noon meeting that's an old-timers meeting. And I go to that every Wednesday because there's always some fool over there taking a cake for 40 years, and it's great. You can just plug your ears for this stuff. Just don't drink and keep coming around. This building has a lot of meaning too, and there's some people here who I want to thank. After I got sober, I got married and we had a daughter. And then about a year and a half later, my former wife, and I had a son who lived for 3 days, and then he died. And as a result of that, we ended up getting a divorce. And not knowing how to be a single father, I did what I had been told to do in AA, and that is I zoomed around and found a bunch of single fathers and said, okay, how do you do single dad? And they said, and they gave me a bunch of suggestions, and I filtered it all down to the point where I always had an apartment within about 2 miles of where my daughter lived. I always had an apartment with an extra bedroom in it, and I put girly stuff in there. And I would have her every other weekend and Wednesdays until she got old enough to dial the phone. And then it was much more loose than that. And I had never been around girls. I mean, I had no sisters, that kind of thing. And so when I would have my daughter at nights, and I needed to go to a lot of meetings, I would come here to Ohio Street. And so that I could come in and sit down and be at the meeting, some of you women who are sitting in here right now used to take my little baby daughter and you would babysit her out here in this parking lot so that I could go to meetings. And I just want to report that my little baby girl now is 35 years old. And she just celebrated 20 years of sobriety. And when my daughter sees me, she comes toward me. And that is not my experience with parent-child relationships, okay? I mean, when I was a kid, it was like, here comes Dad home from work. Let's take a small shovel, go out in the backyard and dig us a foxhole, okay? So that was my experience with parents. And today, I have a new wife now. I married this newcomer, and I still call her a newcomer, but she's sober 31 years. And we have a son who's 30 years old, and he's 9 years sober. And I keep telling them if they just don't drink a day at a time and stick around, pretty soon we're going to have 100 years in my house, okay? what it used to be like. Well, I drank my way into Alcoholics Anonymous. With almost every other thing in my life, I always knew what I was doing while I was doing it. Like if I was tying my shoe, I knew I was tying my shoe, okay? What I didn't know when I was drinking is that I was working my way towards membership in Alcoholics Anonymous. There are several defining experiences in my life that, as I look back now, I see played a major role in my taking the first drink and then continuing to drink. And those defining moments were this childhood that I told you about, because I remember as a child being constantly confused. I had this mother who was a convert Catholic. Okay, and that means she did it on purpose. Okay, and I mean, she really got into it. In her lifetime, she wore out 4 Christian Bibles from reading them. Okay, and she got involved in the church, and she got into being the mothers of this and the sisters of that and the daughters of something else, and she was really into this stuff. And I don't think I ever heard her say a negative word about anybody during her entire lifetime. So she, as I was a child, she would be trying to tell us how the world was supposed to be. And then, of course, 5:30, my father would come home, and he would show us how the world really was. So I remember being confused a great deal. And in order to somehow survive that, somehow, and I don't remember the circumstance, but somehow it became clear to me that if I didn't show people how I felt, then they could not hurt me. And it's just like an art form, really. The more you practice not showing people how you feel, the better you get. And then the more you practice that, you get so good that you don't know how you feel either. Okay? And then the second kind of defining experience in my life is in 1962, I graduated from high school, and I made a tiny mistake in judgment, and I joined the Marine Corps. And about a year and a half later, the then President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, made a somewhat slightly larger mistake in judgment. And off I went to sunny Southeast Asia, to a resort area called Vietnam, where I stayed for 17 months. And but I didn't have much problem there because I was already an expert at not even knowing that I had a feeling, much less showing it. For some of you, I spent 17 months in a war where no one took prisoners, and that will harden your heart. And my solution to all of this, when I got out of the Marine Corps, I came back to the United States and I was going to be normal, which might be the funniest thing I'm going to say today, and none of you laughed. I mean, that they let me and people like me walk around loose in society is astonishing to me, even to this day. Because of what I do for a living, I'm now invited every few years to interact with the Pentagon and the Department of Justice to help create reintegration programs for returning combat veterans, and I'm enormously grateful for that opportunity, which it comes to me only because of you folks and what you've taught me. So the real short version of all this is that when you spend a great deal of time in a combat environment, your kind of survival level, your survival skill set goes clear up to the very top. and it stays that way one day at a time for long periods of time. And so when you come back to the United States, you're dumped into an environment that you are surrounded by people who are absolutely, utterly unaware of everything that is going on around them. And they are a source of constant irritation. And in order to keep from grabbing you up by your little throat and just, what I did is I drank. Now, I didn't understand that's what was happening at the time, but what alcohol did for me is it brought me down to a level that made it tolerable to interact. And that worked for a long time. You know, people get up at the podium and say, oh, alcohol saved my life. And I get up at the podium and say, alcohol saved your life. And then alcohol did a treasonous thing. It stopped working. And that was in about 1972. And of course, I didn't get the memo that it wasn't working. And so I became kind of angrier and more antisocial and zipping right ahead. The week before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, the only friend I had left on earth, I tried to shoot him to death. And thank God I was so drunk. It was an over and under Derringer pistol, and I had loaded the wrong barrel. and when it went click, I went, oh shit. And of course, I continued to drink, and I managed to drink myself into a condition known as alcoholic paralysis. And so they took me off to the hospital, and I was there for 6 days and 6 nights, and I was released on Sunday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That day, I had had my only visitor, and my only visitor was the Budweiser distributor of Bozeman, Montana, which is where I was living at the time. And he was an old World War II combat guy. And so he came into my little room, and I know now, looking backward, he'd probably sat out in the hallway and reread the chapter on working with others before he came in, just so he could drive a stake through my heart, which is exactly what he did. He never said a word about me. He didn't say you're a moral leper. He didn't say you have no willpower. He didn't say you're a scumbag. None of that. He just told me a little bit about him. And then he closed it all out by saying, and then I went to this organization called Alcoholics Anonymous. And the reason I went is because the people I loved the most were the people I hurt the most. And he said, now this is your lucky day, because tonight at 8:30, we have our one meeting a week of Alcoholics Anonymous in Bozeman, Montana. And if you don't have anything else to do, I would be happy to take you to the meeting. And so about 8 o'clock, he came by and picked me up, and we drove over to somebody's little house, and they had pushed all the furniture around, made a little circle, and there were 10 men, and I was the new guy. And they were happy to see me. And I'm one of those really blessed people, because for whatever reason it took that night. And so one day at a time, I've been sober now 13,405 days. And I don't really count, but somebody recently sent me one of those little apps, and you just plug in your little thing, and boom, and it tells you how long you're sober. It even tells you how many heartbeats, which I have no fucking interest at all. And I want to make sure we're taping, and I want to make sure I say fuck one more time. And I do that for 2 reasons. Number one, the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking, and it keeps the speaking requests down. Because I have noticed over the years that we've become a bit more tight-assed. So every once in a while, some fool asks me to go speak at a meeting, and I start right out, and there's always 4 or 5 people sitting over there with a little notepad keeping score of the number of times I cuss. You know, they almost closed down AA one time over this. Some people remember, y'all remember when they closed down 26th and Broadway? Some idiot walked in there and screwed a sign on the podium that said, "No profanity." This is back many years ago. And saying don't do something to a bunch of new alcoholics is I mean, that's like waving the red flag in front of the bull, you know. And so everybody's cussing the whole deal. Well, they actually closed down 26th and Broadway over the Christmas holidays. And I have been waiting for like 30 years for some guy to show up and say, you know, I went to turn myself into AA, but they were closed. You know. Anyway, I'm not sure I actually heard anything in any of the meetings. I just felt I don't know what word to use. I felt safe at these meetings. And when I had about 4 months, because of some of my somewhat less than legal activities in the state of Montana, I had to leave Montana, and I came to California, which was the only other place I'd ever felt kind of semi-at home. In the first week or so that I was here, I met this guy named Fred Ellis. And Fred was an old Marine, and he understood that when somebody pissed me off, where my head went. And he used to ask me, he'd say, "How you gonna do him?" But they're the guys, see, you gotta remember, I was really grim. I couldn't even do what I'm doing here today, which is smile and stuff like that. It was all just one kind of deal, and they used to take me to the Brentwood meeting back when the beginner meeting was the first meeting and nobody went to it and everybody stood outside, and then they had the 8:30 meeting, the speaker meeting, and that's the one everybody went to. And I would stand out on that little porch, and Ellis would show up, and Bob Horrigan, and they would always bring Jack Bailey, who was this goddamn comedian. And he would stand there right near me in earshot, and he'd tell jokes. And I'd kind of go, and then I would move. And then he would move. And he'd tell another little joke, and I'd almost snicker, but I'd move, and then he'd move. And pretty soon you hit a wall down there, and you can't move. And these guys, I often wonder what grace God must have given these guys just so that they wouldn't throw me away, because I was not very nice. And please understand, I had no idea that any of this stuff I'm telling you, I had no idea any of this stuff was happening. I remember I must have been I must have been 9 or 10 years sober, married to my present wife, when she came home one day from work and she was telling me this really great thing that had happened at her work. Oh, this happened and blah, 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 blah. And then she said, well, how do you feel about that? And I said, great. And she said, no, how do you feel about that? And I said, great. And then she looked right at me and she said, then tell your face. And my first thought had something to do with snapping her neck. And my next thought was, is it true? And I said, what do you mean, darling? And she said, well, honey, I love you, and your face never changes. And my immediate response was, nah. which is my immediate response to any time I or anyone else pulls my covers. No, couldn't be. It's like a couple years later, my doctor, I've had 3 doctors die. They all want me to quit smoking. And I tell every one of them the same thing: as soon as you lose that 40 extra pounds, I'm going to quit. And I've buried 3 of them. And for any of you who want me to quit smoking, my suggestion would be go home and read the chapter to the family afterwards. I know you all bypassed that, so go do it. But anyway, this doctor died. And I was sitting home one night, and I said, damn, I'm going to have to go find me another doctor, because I do not generally like doctors. And she said, no, that's not the problem. I said, well, yeah, it is the problem. My doctor died. I got to go find a new doctor. She said, no, that's not the problem. And I said, what's the problem? And she said, you have to go find another Vietnam veteran doctor, because you don't trust anybody else. And of course I said, no. And she said, darling, our gardener is a Vietnam veteran. Our pool guy is a Vietnam veteran. Our accountant is a Vietnam veteran. And I said, okay, time out. Okay. Okay. So I went out and found me a hippie communist pinko doctor. Who not one time has told me to quit smoking. We actually take a time out whenever I go over there once a year. We go out on his little balcony and have a smoke. It's all good. I have hope that he will, he'll outlive me, because I'm tired of finding new ones. Ellis kind of encouraged me to work the steps. And it really wasn't that big of he didn't really need to encourage me that much, because he was the poster boy for the sentence, if you want what we have. And what he had was a nice little house over on Duquesne Street in Culver City. He had a nice, sweet little wife named Betty, who they seemed to get along, and they didn't hit each other, and they seemed to be loving and so forth. And he had a son who came towards him whenever he saw him. And he used to say to me, well, if you want what we have, then you've got to do what we do. Okay. So then I start, reading the book, and then I start working these goofy-ass steps. I had a little problem with the God deal. That got resolved. We got to the 9th step, and I had this enormous list. I had 2 lists. I had a list of emotional amends, and that's where I kind of tore your heart out or something. And then I had physical amends, where I stole your money or hit you in the nose. And so I started doing these amends, and I had read the promises. And I didn't believe any of them, but I'd read them, And there was one in there that I was sure would never happen, and that's the promise where it says, we will comprehend the word serenity, and we will know peace. That was so far outside of my realm of understanding. I just used to jump over it. And they kept, Walter Smith, that was another fella. Some of you remember Walter. He was this old black man that had like a 6th grade education, and yet I tell you, he had more wisdom in the little finger of one hand than I ever hoped to have. And he would say to me things, now, son, if you just they used to be big on calling you son back in the day. Son, if you just keep doing this, one day you're going to become human. Because he knew my big secret, and my big secret is that no matter what I did, or no matter how hard I worked at it, I would never, ever even be able to rise up to the level of basic human being. And today, you got the biggest gift, the two biggest gifts I have been given in sobriety is that neither one of my children have ever seen me drink. And the other big, giant gift that I have been given is that I comprehend the word serenity. And I know peace almost all the time. And in order to get those gifts, this is really God made a really shitty deal here. I get the good stuff, and God just asked me to do a couple little things. God asked me to go to some stupid meetings, which I still do. God asked me to help other little alcoholics. I have people that I sponsor now that are sober 35 years, and my new guys, I got these two new guys of 5 years. I am so proud of one of them. I'm proud of both of them, but I'm so proud of one of them because he's a combat Marine. And he actually did a tour in Afghanistan sober. Man, I called in every debt I had in AA, and that's a lot of them. And I found one other sober son of a bitch in one of those back rear echelon bases, and every 6 weeks he'd get out of his combat thing and he'd go back and spend 2 days with this other sober guy, and they'd do a meeting for 48 hours. I got nothing else. Thank you.